He gave me everything, and then took it all away. That statement didn't come from a scripted drama, but from a real-life lawsuit filed in the Superior Court of Los Angeles in July 2025. The man who spoke it was David Armstrong, once known as the striking young partner of entertainment mogul David Geffen. Beneath the red carpets and million-dollar yachts, another story was unfolding, one that would pit two Davids against each other in a courtroom battle no one saw coming. David Geffen, founder of DreamWorks, a billionaire, a behind-the-scenes kingmaker of the music and film industry, and confidant of presidents and tycoons, now found himself in the crosshairs. Armstrong, his much younger estranged partner, had filed a civil lawsuit alleging manipulation, emotional abuse, and breach of a verbal promise to provide lifelong support. Armstrong, who also went by the name Donovan Michaels, wasn't just any ex. He was a former sex worker, raised in Michigan's foster care system, who claimed Geffen used his wealth and influence to build a relationship based on control, not love. This wasn't a typical breakup. There was no prenup, no clear contract, just years of living together under the shadow of extreme wealth. And now, an eruption that threatened to expose what really goes on behind the walls of the rich and famous. The courtroom, usually reserved for dry financial disputes or Hollywood divorces, was about to become a stage for a deeper question. What happens when love, money, and power collide and one side decides to walk away? In 2016, a young man named David Armstrong created a profile on Seeking Arrangements, a website where wealthy individuals, often older, meet attractive, younger companions. Within days, he received a message that would change his life. The sender wasn't just another affluent suitor. It was David Geffen, already in his 72nd, a legendary figure in entertainment, and one of the richest men in America. Their first meeting, according to Armstrong's civil complaint, was transactional, $10,000 in exchange for a night together. But what followed was not a one-time exchange. Geffen, impressed or intrigued, began reaching out regularly. He sent lavish gifts, extended invitations, and eventually asked Armstrong to move into his Bel Air mansion. No formal contract was signed. No prenup was drafted. But Armstrong says there were promises, subtle at first, and then explicit, that Geffen would provide for him for life, regardless of how the relationship evolved. He believed that their bond was built not just on intimacy, but on commitment and stability. The lawsuit, nearly 40 pages long, outlines a gilded cage, years of life inside Geffen's world of private jets, black-tie galas, and vacations aboard the $590 million yacht Rising Sunday. Armstrong mingled with tech moguls, Oscar-winning directors, and world leaders. From the outside, it looked like the dream life. But behind closed doors, Armstrong says, it was a regime of control. He claims Geffen dictated every detail of his existence, how he dressed, who he could speak to, when he could leave the house. Physical appearance was policed obsessively. Armstrong alleges he was pressured into painful cosmetic procedures, full-body laser hair removal, dental work, even anti-aging treatments not for his health, but for Geffen's image. Intimacy, too, became transactional once again. Armstrong says there were moments he didn't consent, moments when rejection wasn't an option. Parties on the Rising Sun often involved alcohol, Molly, and cocaine. He claims these substances were used to lower his resistance, to make him fun in front of Geffen's circle. I didn't recognize myself anymore, Armstrong stated. I became someone curated for him. The turning point came in February 2025. While Geffen was attending Jeff Bezos's wedding in Venice, Armstrong says he was abruptly asked to vacate their Bel Air home. No warning, no transition. Just a call from an assistant and the silent closing of doors. With nowhere to go and no income of his own, Armstrong began crashing with friends in West Hollywood. That's when he decided to file suit not for revenge, he says, but for survival. The legal heart of the case doesn't lie in what was signed, but in what wasn't. There is no prenup, no formal cohabitation agreement, no official documentation that Armstrong was ever entitled to Geffen's wealth. But Armstrong argues otherwise. On the 22nd of July, 2025, his legal team filed a civil suit, claiming breach of an oral contract, a concept recognized under California law in certain cases where intent and behavior can demonstrate mutual agreement. At stake wasn't just money, but recognition of a power dynamic that Armstrong said was never equal, yet deeply binding. According to the lawsuit, Geffen had made repeated verbal promises: "I'll take care of you forever. You won't ever have to worry. You're mine." These words, Armstrong insists, were not romantic hyperbole. They were part of a lived reality. For years, Geffen had been funding Armstrong's lifestyle, giving him access to multi-million-dollar homes, designer clothing, private travel, and exclusive circles. But Armstrong claims that even those gifts came with conditions. One West Hollywood penthouse, allegedly purchased for Armstrong, was later quietly transferred back into a holding company controlled by Geffen. His credit cards were monitored by Geffen's assistants. Even basic purchases required approval. "He was my banker, my landlord, my partner, and my warden," Armstrong said in a statement. Witnesses began to emerge. A former housekeeper confirmed that Armstrong had no independent source of money and was often anxious about whether Geffen would approve his actions. A yacht staff member described how Armstrong would disappear during parties, later found crying in his cabin after being criticized for embarrassing behavior. One critical element of Armstrong's case is emotional dependency. His lawyers argue that Geffen cultivated a system where Armstrong relied entirely on him financially, socially, psychologically. And when that system was withdrawn, Armstrong was left with nothing but emotional wreckage and a precarious future. Geffen's legal team responded swiftly and firmly. In a press release, his attorney stated, "There was no contract written or spoken. Mr. Geffen supported Mr. Armstrong during their relationship out of generosity, not obligation. Once the relationship ended, so did the support." The case now hinges on whether the court sees those years of support and verbal promises as constituting a legally binding understanding, or merely the informal ebb and flow of a personal relationship. Legal experts are split. Some argue that Armstrong's case is weak, that without written terms, he's chasing ghosts. Others say it reflects a broader truth, that in relationships where one party holds all the power, the absence of paperwork shouldn't nullify the reality of dependence and exploitation. Public opinion was beginning to stir and divide. Was Armstrong a victim of emotional manipulation, or a calculating ex trying to cash in? David Geffen is not your average billionaire. A pioneer in the music and film industry, he co-founded DreamWorks, signed legends like Joni Mitchell and Nirvana, and has been a behind-the-scenes force in American culture for decades. He's also one of the first openly gay billionaires, known for his philanthropy, privacy, and power. But in Armstrong's telling, Geffen was something else entirely. A man obsessed with control, terrified of irrelevance, and quietly ruthless when it came to the people closest to him. The lawsuit paints a portrait of Geffen not as a romantic partner, but as an image curator, a man who demanded perfection from those in his orbit. Armstrong claims Geffen micromanaged everything: his weight, his grooming, his clothing, his public demeanor. Even a slightly wrinkled shirt at a gala allegedly prompted private scolding. He didn't want a boyfriend, Armstrong said. He wanted a reflection. Though the court case is civil, not criminal, it still raises serious ethical questions. Was Geffen's behavior abusive? Was his financial support a form of manipulation disguised as love? Did he blur the line between partner and possession? Armstrong's backstory complicates things further. A former sex worker with a difficult childhood in Michigan's foster system, he entered the relationship with no wealth, no connections, and few prospects. In contrast, Geffen was surrounded by presidents, Oscar winners, and Silicon Valley titans. The imbalance wasn't just financial, it was existential. Armstrong alleges that Geffen preyed on that vulnerability, offering him stability and status in exchange for submission. At times, the relationship did resemble a business arrangement, only without paperwork, HR policies, or limits. Still, Geffen wasn't merely cold. By many accounts, he was generous, even affectionate. Friends recall him doting on Armstrong, buying art in his name, celebrating birthdays with extravagance. But Armstrong says that generosity had strings, and when those strings were cut, he wasn't just heartbroken, he was stranded. The timing of the fallout also raises questions. In February 2025, Geffen attended Jeff Bezos's wedding in Venice. That same week, Armstrong says he was told without warning to vacate their home. He wasn't offered legal counsel. He wasn't given a financial cushion. One day he was someone. The next, he was no one. From Geffen's side, the motive seems simpler. The relationship had run its course. He moved on, as people do. But to Armstrong, the breakup wasn't just cold, it was calculated. A deliberate erasure of a life he helped build. And a message, you were never more than temporary. On the 22nd of July, 2025, the Los Angeles Superior Court didn't look like a courthouse. It looked like a red carpet event. Cameras lined the street. Reporters shouted questions. Inside, two men who once toasted champagne on a $590 million yacht now sat on opposite sides of a courtroom. David Geffen, in a tailored gray suit, appeared calm but visibly irked. He was not used to being the subject of the story. David Armstrong, in soft blue, clean-shaven, focused sat, surrounded by attorneys and supporters. If this was a performance, it was one layered with very real stakes. Geffen's legal team came out swinging. There was no contract, they said flatly. Not on paper, not in speech. Mr. Geffen supported Mr. Armstrong out of affection, not obligation. When the relationship ended, so did the generosity. Armstrong's lawyers presented a different narrative, one rooted in promises made, behaviors reinforced, and a pattern of dependence created over nearly a decade. They introduced emails and text messages in which Geffen had said things like, "You'll always have everything you need. I'll make sure you're taken care of. You belong with me forever." Armstrong took the stand. He recounted his life before Geffen, the foster homes, the modeling gigs, the loneliness. Then he spoke about the transformation and the trap. "He gave me the world, but it wasn't mine to keep. It came with rules I never agreed to, and when I broke them, he took it all back." The courtroom quieted as he described nights on the rising sun, when he was encouraged to take Molly and cocaine to fit in at parties. "I didn't want to be high," he said, "but it was easier than being scolded for being boring." Geffen's lawyers countered, Armstrong was an adult. He had agency. He chose this life, and now, disgruntled, he wanted a payout. But Armstrong's team introduced a key witness, a former personal assistant who testified that Geffen often spoke of Armstrong as his future. The assistant recalled Geffen saying, "If anything happens to me, he gets a house. I'll make sure he's set for life." That statement, though not formalized, became the cornerstone of Armstrong's argument, that there was a verbal understanding, repeated and relied upon, that now carried the weight of a broken promise. In one of the most dramatic moments of the hearing, Armstrong's attorney projected a short video clip, Geffen and Armstrong at a high-profile art gala. Geffen introduces Armstrong not as a guest, but as my partner in every sense of the word. The judge took notes but said little. There was no jury, no cameras inside. The decision would rest solely with the court. But outside, in the court of public opinion, the trial was already dividing headlines, tweets, and talk shows. Armstrong's closing words on the stand were simple. "I didn't ask to be famous, I asked to be safe. I trusted him." Whether the law would agree, that remained to be seen. The court has yet to issue its final ruling, but outside the courthouse, the trial has already been tried and judged in the court of public opinion. Supporters of David Armstrong see him as a symbol, a survivor of a broken system, someone who rose from the foster care pipeline and the margins of sex work, only to find himself entrapped again, this time not by poverty, but by the gilded shackles of wealth and control. Social media swelled with hashtags like #JusticeForDavid and #PowerImbalanceIsAbuse, with users posting comments like, "If this were a woman in the same situation, no one would question it." He was groomed, plain and simple. Money doesn't excuse manipulation. To many, Armstrong represents a rarely told story. When the person in need of protection isn't a helpless minor, but a consenting adult who was nonetheless emotionally vulnerable and ultimately discarded when no longer useful. But the backlash was just as fierce. Critics accused Armstrong of playing the victim too late after living in luxury, mingling with elites, and benefiting from Geffen's fortune for nearly a decade. They point to the timing. Why sue now? And not while the relationship was ongoing. Tabloids and talk shows seized on the narrative. Headlines read, "Trophy turned plaintiff. From yacht to lawsuit. The $7 billion breakup." Legal analysts weighed in with mixed opinions. Some said Armstrong's case was weak, that without a signed prenup or documented agreement, he had no claim. Others said the emotional dependence he described was real, and that courts should begin to recognize verbal contracts in relationships with extreme power imbalances. For Geffen, the damage was already done. Even if he won in court, his legacy was now colored by questions about control, manipulation, and the cost of affection. The man who once orchestrated the rise of legends was now watching his own story spiral beyond his command. And in the end, the deeper question remained: when love, money, and silence mix, can there ever be justice that speaks loud enough? Some trials spark outrage because the crime is shocking. Others grip the public because the names involved are too big to ignore. But the Geffen Armstrong case is different. There's no physical violence, no criminal charges, only two men, a broken promise, and a world built on quiet power. David Armstrong was never meant to be a victim the public could easily embrace. He wasn't innocent. He wasn't modest. He had lived lavishly, yes. But he had also lived dependently, with no financial agency, no personal stability, and, arguably, no true choice. This case pulled back the curtain on a rarely discussed truth: that emotional abuse, manipulation, and coercion don't always come with bruises. Sometimes they come wrapped in designer suits and first-class tickets. And David Geffen? He wasn't a monster. He was, by all accounts, generous, brilliant, and complicated. But in a system where he held all the cards: wealth, lawyers, connections, narrative, the absence of cruelty doesn't guarantee the presence of fairness. It raised a question the court might never be able to fully answer. What happens when someone is given everything, only to have it all taken away the moment they stop being convenient? This wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, about whether promises made in whispers carry the same weight as those made in ink, about whether someone like Armstrong, imperfect, emotional, scarred, deserved the same dignity and justice we afford the polished, powerful, and protected. Regardless of the verdict, one truth lingers. In a world where image is everything and silence is currency, the most dangerous contracts are often the ones no one dares to put on paper. And sometimes, the deepest wounds in the entertainment industry aren't scandals. They're the quiet pains no one ever sees.